The year is 1983. Inside USP Marion, a maximum security federal prison in southern Illinois, two correctional officers, Merle Clutts and Robert Hoffmann, make their routine rounds. Each had served years in the system, veterans of an institution meant to replace Alcatraz. At 10:20 a.m., the silence fractures. Within the span of less than 10 minutes, both men are dead, stabbed by inmates affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood, using shanks crafted from scrap metal scavenged from maintenance tools. By nightfall, Marion is on total lockdown. Not for a day, not for a week, but permanently. For the first time in the history of the Bureau of Prisons, an entire federal facility is sealed, its population confined to cells 23 hours a day. The administration calls it a necessary containment. Historians now recognize it as the moment solitary confinement became institutional policy in the United States. That day did more than end two lives. It triggered a redesign of American incarceration itself, culminating in the most technologically controlled environment ever constructed, ADX Florence, the Supermax of Supermaxes. Prisons are not built in peace. They are built in reaction to failure, political, social, or moral. The narrative of ADX Florence begins not with design blueprints, but with the breakdown of control inside the penitentiaries that preceded it: Alcatraz, Marion, Leavenworth, Lewisburg, and Atlanta. Each generation of federal prison was an attempt to restore order through architecture. Each failed. This investigation traces the lineage of those failures. How a system designed to maintain discipline through confinement instead cultivated violence. How administrative panic gave rise to architectural extremity. And how, by 1994, the Bureau of Prisons had constructed a facility so meticulously engineered that its silence became its form of security. Central thesis: ADX Florence was not conceived as an evolution, it was a containment of fear. Every brick, policy, and circuit in its structure represents a response to the chaos that began at Marion. To understand Florence, one must first descend into the logic of Marion, the prison that replaced Alcatraz. When Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed in 1963, the Bureau of Prisons declared the era of isolated island incarceration over. The Bureau's director, James V. Bennett, promised a new model: modern, rehabilitative, secure, but humane. That model became USP Marion, opened in 1963 in rural Illinois. It was intended to be the most progressive maximum security prison in the nation. Each cell measured 6 by 9 feet, larger than Alcatraz. Each unit had day rooms. There were workshops, educational programs, and even art classes. But from the start, Marion inherited a paradox. It housed the Bureau's most dangerous prisoners, often those transferred from institutions they'd already disrupted, while attempting to foster reform. By the late 1970s, violence was endemic. During that decade, federal prisons became incubators for racially organized gangs. Groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Mexican Mafia divided the yards into territories of blood and affiliation. In Marion, the Brotherhood controlled contraband, movement, and fear. Intelligence reports from 1979 describe a shadow command structure more effective than official hierarchy. The Bureau's traditional disciplinary methods, loss of privileges, short-term segregation, were meaningless against inmates already serving life sentences. Control eroded cell by cell. October 22, 1983, the day of reckoning. It began as routine. Officer Clutts escorted Thomas Silverstein, a Brotherhood enforcer, back from recreation. As Clutts unlocked the cell door, Silverstein attacked, stabbing him repeatedly with a weapon fashioned from steel and tape. Minutes later, across the compound, inmate Clayton Fountain murdered Officer Hoffmann in an identical assault. The dual killings were coordinated through messages passed in code between cell blocks. For the Bureau of Prisons, it was not simply murder, it was an uprising in miniature, a collapse of institutional sovereignty. Within hours, Marion's warden, Ralph Aaron, ordered a full lockdown. Every prisoner was confined to his cell. Workshops and communal areas were closed permanently. The experiment in rehabilitative maximum security was over. Initially temporary, the lockdown soon evolved into a permanent operating procedure. By early 1984, Marion functioned as a control unit. Each inmate isolated 23 hours a day, human interaction reduced to near zero. The Bureau described it as an environment of secure management. Critics called it an experiment in behavioral nullification. In 1985, the American Civil Liberties Union filed suits citing Eighth Amendment violations. The Bureau defended the policy, stating, "The control unit at Marion is not punitive. It is preventive." This language, preventive, not punitive, would later form the administrative DNA of ADX Florence. Marion's lockdown model became the prototype for special housing units nationwide. By 1988, every major federal prison contained at least one high-security isolation block modeled on Marion's operations manual. Warden reports described it as an effective measure for managing high-risk inmates. But internal Bureau memos reveal a different motive: containment of institutional embarrassment. A 1987 internal memo from the Federal Correctional Institution at Leavenworth reads, "Public confidence in Bureau control remains unstable. Marion provides a symbol of regained authority. Symbolism, not strategy, drove the replication. The 1980s federal war on drugs swelled prison populations beyond designed capacity. Between 1980 and 1990, the number of federal inmates doubled from 24,000 to 58,000. Facilities built for rehabilitation now operated as holding tanks. Marion's permanent lockdown, intended for a few hundred, became the template for a nation of tens of thousands. By 1990, correctional officers reported burnout, assaults, and near-constant tension. Congressional oversight hearings in 1989 describe a correctional system at its threshold of functional collapse. Within that chaos, Bureau planners began quietly drafting blueprints for a facility immune to disruption. The Bureau's design and construction branch, working with private contractors from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, initiated Project 1216F, a plan for a facility where physical layout would enforce psychological compliance. Minutes from a 1990 planning session specify design goals: eliminate group movement entirely, achieve acoustic isolation between cells, enable staff control without direct presence. Each goal was a direct answer to the failures of Marion. Where Marion's violence spread through communication and proximity, the new design would remove both. This facility would not require lockdowns. It would be built as one. In 1991, the Bureau selected Florence, Colorado, as the site for what would become ADX. Reasons were logistical and symbolic. Remote desert landscape minimizing escape potential. Proximity to existing medium and high-security complexes, forming the Florence Correctional Complex. A location politically invisible, rural, economically dependent, and geographically defensible. Local officials welcomed the project. Prisons meant federal funding, construction jobs, and infrastructure. Few grasped that the incoming facility was not merely another penitentiary, but a new species of confinement. Construction began in 1992. Cost, $60 million. Projected capacity, 490 inmates. Unlike Marion, ADX was never meant to rehabilitate. Its mission statement defined it as a control environment for inmates requiring the highest degree of security. Every aspect of design served that phrase: cells, concrete cast, fixtures integrated, soundproofed. Windows, 4-inch slits angled to prevent sky visibility. Doors, double-layered steel with electronic locks. Corridors, segmented to prevent line-of-sight communication. Architecturally, ADX was the logical conclusion of Marion's lockdown, a physical manifestation of administrative fear transformed into concrete geometry. By the time ADX opened in 1994, the Bureau's internal culture had shifted. Control was no longer a policy. It was an identity. Training manuals for new officers described the mission as total environmental dominance. The phrase originated not in criminology but in military doctrine. Prisons were no longer about custody, they were about containment of chaos. The tragedy at Marion had not only reshaped architecture, it had redefined the philosophy of punishment, and ADX Florence would become its monument. By the early 1990s, the Bureau of Prisons had learned a lesson it would not unlearn. Violence, once it erupts, cannot be negotiated, only contained. From that belief came the ADX operational doctrine, finalized in 1993 under the Title Program Statement 5100.07, Inmate Security Designation and Custody Classification. The manual defines the core logic of Florence. Control is achieved when the environment removes the capacity for coordinated disruption. Every policy thereafter translated that principle into physical and administrative architecture. At Marion, the Bureau reacted to crisis. At Florence, it would design crisis out of existence. The transition from human oversight to systems oversight. In most federal institutions, correctional officers patrol, mediate disputes, and manage movement. In ADX, those duties were reassigned to infrastructure. Motion sensors, biometric scanners, and electronically controlled doors replaced the social layer of prison management. An officer could now monitor an entire unit from a glass control booth, using a touchscreen panel to unlock or isolate any door in seconds. The new term for staff role was electronic escort. Where Marion's guards physically walked the tiers, Florence's controlled them through circuits and cameras. This transition was not cosmetic, it was philosophical. The system itself became the warden. The daily structure at ADX functions like a biological clock designed by engineers. Every action, sleep, hygiene, exercise, meals, is dictated by electronic schedule. Cells open remotely for feeding. A single slot allows the passage of a tray, followed by re-engagement of magnetic locks. The schedule never changes. Deviation is considered disorder. By creating total predictability, the Bureau believed it could erase the variables that led to violence at Marion. Group contact, surprise, emotion. ADX Florence, in effect, transformed the chaos of human interaction into the rhythm of machinery. The institution calls this environmental stability. Each inmate occupies a 7 by 12-foot cell composed entirely of reinforced concrete. Furniture is cast into the structure, bed, desk, stool, removing the possibility of weapon fabrication. Windows measure 4 inches by 36 inches, set at angles so narrow that even the horizon cannot be seen directly. Between cells lies an acoustic buffer wall, filled with sound-absorbing material designed to prevent communication through tapping or shouting. At Marion, inmates passed messages through pipes. At Florence, those pathways were removed. The very geometry of the building is weaponized against connection. The core of ADX is a system of segmented corridors, each designed to interrupt visibility and sound transmission. Doors open toward opaque partitions. Turns occur every 10 to 12 meters, preventing straight sight lines. From above, the layout resembles a fractal cross, radiating corridors that never meet. Architectural renderings from the Corps of Engineers note the intent explicitly. Segmentation shall prevent communal awareness. In this environment, no one sees more than one other person at a time. There are no open spaces, no audible echoes, no shared vantage points. Control is maintained by depriving inmates of spatial coherence. Movement within ADX follows what administrators call sequential isolation. An inmate moves from cell to shower to recreation pen through a chain of automated openings, each controlled from a separate station. At no point is an individual unmonitored, and at no point do two individuals occupy the same unpartitioned area. The recreation yard is not a yard at all, but a concrete pen roughly the size of a single cell, open only to the sky through a wire mesh ceiling. The system eliminates both opportunity and uncertainty. Where Marion relied on guards to enforce separation, Florence relies on architecture to make violation physically impossible. In the 1980s, a single compromised key could unlock a cell block. At ADX, there are no keys. Every door operates on an electronic locking system controlled through the Security Management System, SMS, which records every open, close, and override event to a timestamp database. The Bureau's intention was dual: increase accountability and eliminate human discretion. An officer could no longer make an unauthorized gesture of leniency or cruelty. The system itself documented everything. But by automating mercy, it also eliminated it. Following internal studies of inmate behavior at Marion, bureau psychologists concluded that sensory deprivation reduces aggression, at least temporarily. ADX operationalized this theory. Lighting remains constant, 24-hour low-intensity fluorescence, producing neither full day nor night. Temperature and airflow are regulated centrally. Noise levels never exceed 30 decibels. This environment has a name, the Low Stimulus Control Program. Its stated purpose is to reduce environmental triggers. Its unstated result is the erasure of ordinary human experience. Everything unpredictable, sound, light, temperature, contact, has been engineered out. Cameras occupy every angle of the facility. Hallways, recreation areas, feeding slots. Unlike traditional surveillance, these cameras are not deterrents. They are instruments of equilibrium. The Bureau's internal design brief for ADX specifies, the surveillance network functions as both detector and deterrent. Its constancy substitutes for staff proximity. Every movement is recorded, analyzed, archived. Inmates rarely see staff. They experience oversight as mechanical omnipresence. At Marion, officers risked their lives entering cells. At Florence, officers rarely enter at all. In the early 2000s, ADX introduced a step-down program intended to allow inmates to earn transfer to less restrictive units. The program's stages measure compliance through observation, silence, cooperation, stability. Yet those same traits are also symptoms of sensory adaptation. The quieter an inmate becomes, the more compliant he appears. The more compliant he appears, the longer he remains. Behavioral control and psychological flattening are indistinguishable. Where Marion's crisis was noise and rebellion, Florence's danger is quiet endurance. Even correctional officers have described the environment as psychologically heavy. Reports from the early 2000s note elevated turnover and reduced verbal communication among staff. As at Marion, control exacted its cost. Supervisory assessments record that officers demonstrate reduced empathy response after 6 months in rotation. Exposure to an environment built on perpetual stillness changes perception. The silence does not discriminate, it governs everyone inside the perimeter. Though designed to supersede Marion, ADX inherited its operational DNA. The language of preventive isolation, the logic of total separation, the assumption that architecture can manage behavior all trace back to 1983. Where Marion improvised confinement under crisis, Florence professionalized it. Where Marion reacted to violence, Florence institutionalized fear of it. The two prisons form a single historical organism, Marion as the wound, Florence as the scar. In closed-door hearings, Bureau administrators described ADX as a fortress of last resort. They did not frame it as a prison but as a containment technology, a national security instrument for the post-Marion age. Over time, that distinction blurred. What began as a specific response to prison violence evolved into a general doctrine for any perceived threat. Terrorism suspects, cartel leaders, and domestic radicals all entered the same architecture born from 2 murders in Illinois. History, in bureaucratic terms, had been rewritten as design specification. By 1999, the Bureau measured success not by rehabilitation or recidivism, but by incident reduction rate. Florence reported a rate approaching 0. The data appeared flawless. No riots, no escapes, no large-scale violence. Yet beneath that silence, external observers noted rising rates of psychological breakdown, self-harm, and suicide attempts. The official narrative cited personal pathology. Unofficially, even Bureau clinicians acknowledged the system itself as the stimulus. Still, from a purely operational perspective, ADX worked exactly as intended. The data proved the design. Every bureaucratic machine requires metrics, and every metric creates blindness. At ADX, noise and incident logs replaced human observation. A quiet day on paper meant success. The human dimension was inaudible. This was the institutional evolution of Marion's crisis management. If sound and motion indicated danger, their absence became proof of safety. The logic was circular but efficient. In a system governed by silence, no one hears dissent. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, It was described as a unique solution for unique inmates. Within a decade, that uniqueness vanished. By 2005, more than 40 states had built or retrofitted Supermax-style units, each citing the Bureau of Prisons as technical authority. The control unit model, once confined to Marion, became national architecture. Pelican Bay State Prison, CA, TAM Supermax, IL, Ohio State Penitentiary, Red Onion State Prison, VA. Blueprints echoed ADX's. Reinforced concrete cells, restricted sightlines, electronic doors, sound-absorptive walls. The Bureau's engineering branch even circulated a design manual, Federal Prototype High-Security Facility Guidelines, 1996, offering modular blueprints adaptable to state budgets. Thus, a system built from panic became a template industry. Each Supermax carried staggering cost. ADX itself cost roughly $60 million to build and about $90,000 per inmate annually, 3 times the standard high-security cost. But politically, the arithmetic worked. Supermax prisons brought federal contracts, construction jobs, and permanent employment to rural counties decimated by industrial decline. Counties like Fremont, Colorado, and Lee, Virginia, became prison economies. Local media described new facilities as economic stabilizers. Silence became commerce. The economic self-interest that sustained Marion's lockdown now anchored Florence's permanence. The architecture of fear had found its funding mechanism. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing and, later, the 1995 Oklahoma City attack shifted Supermax logic from domestic corrections to national security. By 1997, terrorism-related detainees were being placed under Special Administrative Measures, SAMS, at ADX Florence. Under SAMS, communication is restricted even between attorney and client. Letters, calls, and visits pass through pre-screening by multiple federal agencies. The same mechanical isolation that once contained gang leaders now served counterterrorism. Florence thus became the intersection of corrections and intelligence, a site where architecture enforced secrecy itself. Official reports still cite ADX as the most secure prison in the world. Measured by escapes and large-scale violence, the claim is true. Measured by human stability, it collapses. Between 2000 and 2020, multiple lawsuits alleged that inmates suffering severe mental illness were housed indefinitely in conditions exacerbating their disorders. In 2012, Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons forced partial reforms. Federal Judge Richard Match wrote, "The Eighth Amendment does not permit a sentence of torment." The Bureau settled, agreeing to expand mental health services and transfer some inmates to psychiatric facilities. Yet the architectural structure remained unchanged. The system could treat individuals but not redesign itself. Clinical analyses following the Cunningham settlement revealed patterns already familiar from Marion. Severe sensory monotony leading to hallucinations, distorted perception of time, self-directed aggression. Psychologists identified a syndrome unofficially termed ADX adaptation, a behavioral flattening in which subjects exhibit mechanical routines, minimal effect, and diminished language use. The Bureau's internal memoranda described these same symptoms neutrally as predictable adjustment indicators. The system, still fluent in bureaucratic euphemism, translated trauma into compliance. Unlike Marion, which became a national scandal in 1983, Florence rarely enters the public narrative. Its isolation works both physically and culturally. Journalists require months of approval to visit. Cameras are prohibited. Most footage is drawn from official tours under escort. The absence of imagery produces a paradox. The most controlled environment in America is also its least visible. Public understanding depends on court transcripts, architectural plans, and declassified fragments. In this vacuum, myth replaces documentation. ADX becomes symbol rather than site, a ghost facility representing control itself.